I'm not going to give another formal introduction after yesterday. I know several of you were here yesterday and heard Joyelle's delightful performance. She was quite wonderful. And one or two things I forgot to say in my introduction then, which I'll say now, because she's appearing in the guise of a lecturer, therefore has to be credentialed appropriately.
Yes,
so
yes.
Joyelle is
How did I get in here?
An associate professor at the University of Notre Dame, where she directs the creative writing program. She has recently published this really notable collection of essays, the Necropastoral. And as I remarked very briefly yesterday, the first thing that grabbed me about this was her writing about Wilfred Owen. And the reason for that very briefly is that, and I don't know if it's still true in high schools, but during my high school education, an introduction to poetry was often centered on the poets of the First World War, precisely because you didn't really need to talk about poetry at all. You could just talk about the historical context and all of those things which were not kind of so embarrassing as all of those kind of sloppy and muddy and gloopy feelings around in poems by the likes of Wilfred Owen and so on. So to encounter this sort of radically Deleuzian reading of Wilfred Owen, I thought was very exciting indeed, and has lured me into the rest of this notably wide-ranging volume. And Joyelle's interests as represented, for example, in her editorship of the extraordinary action books, range across the world. And she is a wonderful guide to a whole range of otherwise occluded literatures in the American canon. So it's great to have her here and to welcome her to this repeat performance.
Woohoo! All right, thank you. Hello, thank you, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to be here. I'm working on a borrowed computer with kind of a nutty presentation, so anything that happens will be very exciting, kind of slapstick style presentation. And yes, I am going to present to you guys some of my ideas from the Necropastoral, and hopefully by the end of this talk, you will have some questions for me about what that is, obviously, and any objections that you would like to have, and we can talk about Wilfred Owen or whatever you like. So thank you in advance, and thank you so much, Kelly, for making everything happen today. So we'll get started. So the name of my talk is The Necropastoral Spectacle, Ex-Termination, and Anachronism. I think I got every kind of punctuation up there that was like possible to get, which I hope looks a little manic and ill, so I'm glad about that. All right, let's see what happens when I start pressing buttons, shall I? Oh, that's awesome. Okay, here we go. This is the first poem I'm going to discuss. So here we go. We'll just start by reading a poem, shall we? This is The History of Violets. It's by the Uruguayan poet Marosa DiGiorgio. It's translated by Janine Marie Pites. It's obviously translated from the Spanish, and it is available from Ugly Duckling Press, if you're interested in that. As a small press publisher, I have to plug the press responsible for this. Is a beautiful book. You should get it. So here's the poem. The gladiolus is a spear, its edge loaded with carnations, a knife of carnations. It jumps through the window, kneels on the table. It's a vagrant flame burning up our papers, our dresses. Mother swears that a dead man has risen. She mentions her father and mother and starts to cry. The pink gladiolus opened up in our home. But scare it, tell it to go. That crazy lily is going to kill us. It was a great last line. So the gladiolus for today's talk is our emblem because it's a flower. It's a sword. It's actually a little sword from the Latin gladius, meaning sword. So it's a weaponized flower. For everything can be weaponized in an age of terror. Dolphins, monkeys, video games, insects, vaccines, garbage, individual molecules. The gladiolus looks like this. That's your little sword for today. But this gladiolus is obviously a stunted weapon, a little weapon, a floral weapon, because it is over-fructified to the point nearly of decay. It is loaded as a gun with blossoms, because DiGiorgio says its edge loaded with carnation. So it's loaded with blossoms. And what kind of blossoms? These blossoms. These are carnations in DiGiorgio's Spanish claveles. Claveles from the Catalan root clavel, nail. So they're nail flowers. And my friend, the Mexican-American poet Eduardo Corral, suggests coffin nails. Well, the poet Rosa Alcala has suggested that these flowers might suggest the nails of the cross. So I asked them, what does claveles evoke for you as Spanish-speaking poets? And these are some of the ideas that they had. But in English, of course, we call them carnations, possibly derived or maybe popularly misderived from the Latin root caro, flesh flowers. Thus, the weaponized sword flower of the gladiolus arms himself the sword flower gladiolus arms itself with another monstrous flower, claveles, the coffin nail, or the carnation, the flesh blossom, on its burgeoning, deadly flame. DiGiorgio's gladiolus deploys in many media. It is both sword and flower, and it is also a flame. If I can get back to the poem. Whoop, 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 where are you? Here we go, all right. So it is both a sword and a flower, and it's also a flame. And simultaneously a kind of paper knife, because it's made of the most dubious of materials, ink and paper. It slits open the book, it unleashes a suppressed text, it slits open a dress, come in. It makes a slit that reveals the girl speaker's slit. Mother reverts vaguely to prayer, a dead man has risen, but the girl speaker trains the hyperfocus of her perception on the impossible animations and violations of the knife, weapon, flesh, nail, flower. She notes, it jumps through the window, it nails on the table, it burns up everything. This gladiolus is a flaming creature. Its biggest threat is not its mobility, but its overripeness, which burns not a warrior red, but a lascivious, dubious, flushed pink. In the second half of the poem, our gladiolus comes into pinkness at the exact moment as it exercises its threat. The pink gladiolus opened up in our home. The lily, the flower of the Virgin Mary, is meek no more. It is a sword, a male organ, although it is also unmanly because small and dressed in cloying pink. It's going to kill us with its toxic transvestite blossoms. It will do this while making an us of us. Before this crazy lily, the humans become undifferentiated, a species, a swarm, which the historian Sven Lindqvist points out is the first rhetorical move necessary for the logic of extermination to operate, as when Mr. Kurtz scrawls in his report from the Heart of Darkness, exterminate all the brutes. But DiGiorgio's lily gladiolus is singular, although it is covered in clusters of nails or flesh carnations. It is gaudy, and gaudy, the definition of gaudy is showy and tastelessly rich. It comes from the Middle English, probably refers to the large ornamental bead in a rosary, rosary itself invoking a rose garden, as well as the Catholic beads upon which one counts off prayers to the Virgin Mary. But there is a parallel meaning in the word gaudy. Gaudy also means full of trickery from the 1520s, gaud, deceptions, trick, jest, trick. And that possibly also comes from the Anglo-French gaudir, be merry, scoff, or gaudere, rejoice. So when we think about this gaudy flower, and we think about this gaudy flower who comes in the window and threatens to destroy everything and is a crazy lily that's going to kill us, we have to remember that it might be an exterminating angel, itself a sword, adorned with an angel's usual gender indeterminacy. It is by this lush, gaudy, tricky, joyful, ornamented apparition that we human inmates of the poem are to be exterminated. That crazy lily is going to kill us. To understand Marosa DiGiorgio's poem as an extermination, and by extension, to understand the place of poetry in this omni-necrotic climate of violence and extinction and extermination in which we find ourselves in the year of our Lord 2015, I'm going to turn to another etymology, Latin etymology of the English term extermination. And first of all, a side note on etymologies, which are going to swell like impossible bubonic tuberoses through my paper today. Etymologies are perhaps the most occult and anachronistic of heuristics, looking for ghost forms written into the words themselves. The dead can rise and write and run their extinct software again. Etymologies are zombie knowledge, somatic, hyperfloral branching systems which run each time the word is employed. They're also often dubious. Like you'll run into like, this was a mistranslate or back etymology, and that's fine. How could it be? It's all made up anyway, right? When Jack Spicer imagines Rimbaud in the dead letter office in Charleville in his inspired crackpot biography of the poet, it is specifically because the dead can speak again. The dead are always waiting to repeat themselves. To quote Suzanne Laurie Parks, history is time that won't quit. End note on etymologies. Back to the extermination. So the etymology of extermination is this. It comes from exterminare, to drive out beyond the boundaries. So that's ex, out, and terminus, boundary line. So to exterminate is to drive out, to drive beyond the boundaries, beyond the terminus. In its more contemporary sense, to exterminate is to annihilate, to drive out into nothingness, into nihil, to push some group of humans, animals, microbes, undesirable plants beyond the boundary and into death. And for this etymological link, I am grateful to the Swedish historian Sven Lindqvist. In the case of Giorgio's gladiolus, I'm almost done talking about it, but not quite. Its entry into the house is disturbing specifically because it de-exterminates itself. That is, it crosses back over the boundary with its hyperfluidity, and it permeates the supposedly well-delineated domestic space. It carries its lawless carnality, its fleshiness, its flesh-thirstiness, its coffin nails, its hybridity, its uncertain sexuality, as both its weapon and its costume. And it's going to kill everyone. It's going to reverse the poles of extermination, and by reverse osmosis, perhaps push back into civilized space with its pink frilly death pollen, with which its blade is dressed like pink fleshy icing on the cake. So in that sense, it exterminates. It's been exterminated, pushed outside the house. It's going to exterminate and come back into the house. And for this, I think of an emblem for my paper today and the idea of extermination. So for a picture of what extermination might look like in another medium, let's try this. I'm going to show you a short clip. This is by the Chicago sculptor Nick Cave, who you guys might know. And let's take a look. So these are his sound suits. His practice is to build these really beautiful, sculptural, crazy suits. But when he started building them, he didn't realize that when they were inhabited, they made noise. And suddenly, this kind of occult property of sound took over the sculpture and is now, and the motion and the sound associated with it is what he is now pretty much known for. And these suits are thought of as sound suits, even though when he makes them, they're sculptures and silent. Once they're worn, they actually become the sound suits and they become an event. And they, in this little clip, I will show you from a couple back. Okay, go ahead and play a clip. I don't know how to make it quieter. Is that too loud? I'm sorry. That's Nick Cave, your fellow Chicagoan. Do you know me make it quiet? Down here? Oh, yes. We don't necessarily need the radio head, obviously. So this is what they look like in motion, and this is what they look like on the streets of Chicago. Art comes across the boundary into the streets. And I wish this soundtrack, which seems to be part of something official from Nick Cave, weren't there so we could hear the rustling sound, but we can imagine that. And this is other versions of the sound suits. I kind of want to watch it now and not finish the presentation, but. All right, back to this. So that's one place I started seeing, when I started meditating on this poem by DiGiorgio, I started seeing these lilies and these gladioluses, these things that were kind of a weapon and kind of a costume and seemed to have a couple genres and genders going, and that most importantly, they moved across boundaries and back into the space that they were supposedly walled out of, like art's in the gallery, but now it's in the street. Okay, but it's this reversal of currents and this supersaturation, this idea of crossing death's border, exterminating, not exterminating, but exterminating, that I isolate as the political gesture of the decadence, of monstrousness. Extermination is an unfitness which refuses to stay exterminated. Pushed over the terminus, it recrosses the boundaries of death and life and exhibits an uncanny vitality, an undeadness maybe. I have named this tendency the necropastoral. There's a picture for you to look at. It's obviously from Jack Smith's Normal Love. I'll talk more about that in a minute. Okay, so here's where I define my neologism, the necropastoral. The term the necropastoral is, of course, a necro-neologism. When I reframe the pastoral, already a defunct, anachronistic, dead, imperial, and imperialistic literary form as a necropastoral, I am calling attention to the excesses, intensities, inequalities, anachronisms, morbidities already implicit in the pastoral genre, which itself was contrived to represent separation, quarantine, timelessness, stasis, and protection from upset and death. But the necropastoral seeks to activate these suppressed aspects of the pastoral, the necrotized, the infectious, the counterfeit. The pastoral as a site not of separation, but of deadly traffic, not a wall, but a membrane, not an idyll, but an unstable compact, not a place of simplicity, but of dubious intentions. For example, back to Nick Cave, it was interesting as I looked for clips to show you, when he does these things on college campuses and art galleries, they're called sound suit invasions. So I think that's very interesting. He himself seems to be a very charming person and is interested in empathy and understanding and so forth, but for some reason these processions are called invasions. So there's like a little trace of insurgency in them, I think. Or like counter-imperialism from the side of the held back. Where am I here? So, not a place of simplicity, but dubious intentions. Where classical pastoral insists on separation, necropastoral posits supersaturation, leaking, counter-contamination. Our contemporary understandings of biohazard and ecology activates the specter of the necropastoral, and our ravenous media overexposes it. The necropastoral is the toxic double of our eviscerating, flammable contemporary world where avian flu, swine flu, mad cow disease, toxic contamination via industrial waste, hormones and milk, poisons leaching out of formaldehyde FEMA trailers, chemical warfare, bombing campaigns, refugee camps where typhus and diarrhea take lives, or where hunting potable water puts women and children in grave danger. All these have destroyed the idea of a bordered or bounded body and mark the porousness of the human body as its most characteristic quality. I mean, another example would be Oyatsanapa, right? They take 43 teaching students and just make them disappear. And they say, oh, they're all in this grave, and they're not in that grave. Maybe they're in another grave. This idea that like the difference between a student body and a mass grave, there's no distance between them. It's just a question of which mass grave it is. That's where you find the student body, in the mass grave. It's another example. Examples abound. The body is a medium for infection, saturation, death. The supersaturated leaking membrane of the necropastoral is as politicized by our modern understanding of ecology, globalization, the damage of industrial politics and warfare does to bodies. The spectral quality of capitalism, the way money and debt accrues and erodes in damaging patterns, the way damage to bodies is sometimes the first materialization of corporate malfeasance, the occult way capitalism's distribution systems amplify economic, political, and biological damage as it spreads across the globe. This is the necropastoral. It is the lethal double of the pastoral. It is the inversion of its fantasy of permanent, separated rural peace. In emphasizing the counterfeit nature of the pastoral, the necropastoral makes visible the fact that nothing is pure or natural, that mutation and evolution are inhuman technologies, that all political assertions of the natural and pure are themselves moribund and counterfeit, infected and rabid. So, an text for me for thinking about the necropastoral is Normal Love, the famously unfinished film by the American underground 20th century filmmaker Jack Smith. I'll play just a few minutes here, if it works, so you can see this glorious mess of a film, which required Jack Smith to travel from the village to the countryside in Connecticut with a bunch of drag queens, drug addicts, and homeless people. And once they got there in the early 60s, they spray painted the trees a more desirable shade of green, and they even painted the cows to get more good-looking cows. And then they made a movie, which was, as he said, of pink extravagance. And he never finished this film. He kept cutting and recutting it, like, forever. So this is one still from this film, so you can already see it's this kind of like invasion of classical kind of imagery with a whole lot of hyperfluidity and degeneracy and a kind of reveling. So there's the cows, there's the poor cows. Let's see what's going on in this film. It seems like it lost my mark. Just for example, things look like this. They're dressed as kind of B-movie mummies and stuff, and they're trampling through Connecticut. There's cows. There's lots of hilarious sequences, but the sequences have never really been edited into a final film, which also is very necropastoral. And these are all urbanites, So that's very classical too, when the urbanites go into the country. And the nonsense just goes on and on. Let's find something else to look at. Diane DePrima is in this film, and so is Andy Warhol. I don't know, someone's come to a bad end. The whole film ends with these people romping on a big pink cake designed by Klaus Oldenburg. So nature and artifice totally impermeated here. I almost don't want to know where this camera is going. Could be going anywhere. A mummy, of course, right? In the garden. All right, so the term necropastoral, yada, yada, you get it, right? It appropriates the contaminatory anxiety buried in the pastoral's binarisms in the first place, and it uses this anxiety to kind of like exaggerate something and shoot it back, to exterminate it, and apply it as a kind of engine to spasm back across the border and into the body of the state, the family, and the individual to exterminate. And now back to the gladiolus. Why not? I now got back to our gladiolus for a demonstration of how such a dandy, a little sword, might enter and wreck a house. And I give you this apex of 20th century, late 20th century pop dandyism, Morrissey, swinging his gladiolus here like a nunchuck. All right, so in this little clip, I am going to show you. I almost don't want to spoil it. Let's watch a few minutes of it, and then I will make my important pronouncements. It's Charming Man. You may know this. Oh my gosh, carnations. Watch the flowers. And those are gladioli, obviously. Gladioli. Carnations coming from the would-be orifice missing from the electric guitar. Pedals on the hi-hat. You know, this is just total floral insemination happening here. That's probably enough of that, right? Okay, fine. Look, let's end on the snarl. Okay, so I give you this apex of late 20th century pop dandyism. Morrissey swinging the gladiolus like a nunchuck in this video for the 1983 hit This Charming Man. I believe he's also standing on a bed of rotting carnations or coffin nails or rotting flesh. And in place of reproductive sex, that utilitarian affair, he scatters the golden pollen on the already golden high hit symbols, gold gilt with gold. In English, we say that to go too far with decoration of any kind or excess of any kind is to gild the lily. But here we see our crazy lily lilying the gold gilding, right? So a note here about dandies. Dandies are an important citizen of the necropastoral. So I'm going to talk about them a little bit because the dandy represents debt and death. That is an economic and a biological dead end. He does not participate in national or international economies, he earns no money, and he has no problem buying on credit. According to Baudelaire, the dandy has, quote, no profession but elegance. He does not participate in the conventional biological economy that ensures the production of children, what Edelman has called reproductive futurism. His love life is, to quote Baudelaire, a sudden impulse full of ardor and reverie, rather than a, quote, distastefully utilitarian affair. In Baudelaire, the dandy is a fabulous degenerate. He says, dandyism is a setting sun. Like the declining star, it is magnificent, without heat, and full of melancholy. A dandy may be blasé, but he may even suffer in pain, but in the latter case, he will keep smiling like a Spartan under the bite of the fox. He is mannered, this is all paraphrasing what Baudelaire has to say. He says that the dandy will smile, even if he's suffering, he will smile like the Spartan under the bite of the fox. He is mannered like a Jesuit, perinde ac cadaver, in the manner of a corpse. So these are the observations that Baudelaire makes, like he will suffer in the manner of a corpse while remaining glamorous. The glamour of the dandy and his closeness to violence, pain, and death are inextricable. Now I'm talking in my own voice. He holds these in and as his body, his weapon, and his costume. Baudelaire's term for these figures, the French term is les incroyables, the incredibles, those who exceed their credit and those who are beyond belief. And if you haven't read Baudelaire's very short essay on the dandy from the Painter of Modern Life, it's very, very bolstering. It's like saying prayers. It'll give you strength for the day. So when the poem and the video are superimposed on each other, Morrissey Marosa envisage and embody a florid intruder, a little pink florid sword with a drooping coxcomb haircut that leaps in through the window, ravishes the house with a flouncy, rotting death, which as human inmates would have liked to exclude, to exterminate, to keep out, to push beyond the boundary. But this charming man-flower reverses the current of such exterminations. It creates a zone of threat, but also toxic charm, fluidity, the peak of fever, the point just at decay. It makes a zone of the terminus and infests it with its presence, the presence of pinkness, of reading, of music, of art. It infects it. It is this hypervernal and toxic zone, a zone of revenge and queerness and perverse penetration that I have labeled the necropastoral. And I want to stress here that that superimposition, two things layered on top of each other, which cannot but must co-survive in a collapsed space, is also a characteristic of the necropastoral. I refer to this in the book, if you should read it, as the necropastoral's impossible and/or, a method that allows me to jump all over the globe and across time and host strange meetings of disparate texts and work anachronistically across time zones and meaning regimes. Another model of this is the internet. So I want to make clear that I'm on the side of the gladiolus, if that's not clear by my hairdo. My presentation is all based on my hairdo today. The crazy lily and the necropastoral, because, and here's the politics, I think that it is this reversal of the currents of extermination that is the force of the decadence against all forms of oppression, sexual, political, economic, or violent. It is a force of the decadence against all supposed sanities that attempt to cloak the reality of extermination, that indeed try to exterminate the violence and suffering of the world from Western consciousness and assign it to hearts of darkness elsewhere in the globe, that attempt to put up walls, literal walls or firewalls or other kinds of censorship, and wall suffering out of the police. Decadence reminds us that suffering, decay, death, and violence are everywhere, that the majority of people in all parts of the globe are disempowered, dispossessed, that the gospel of health and wealth masks this, or Fitbit masks this, that the body is a poor defense against suffering, and that it must, in its honesty, present itself as weak and vulnerable to the toxins of the world. Unless we can admit this, then the ravages and the rapacity of our profit makers and power grabbers will continue as we meekly pursue our personal physical fitness. It's like an obsession of this paper. No more physical fitness. Our balanced budgets and our home economics. The necropastoral with its crazy invading lilies, its gladioli, its merry destructive swords, its victim flesh flowers now displayed as their own genitalia, brings the violence which has been dispersed across the planet, however unevenly, back through the window to burn down the house. It is an ex-termination. It turns the terminus into a zone, fills it with rotting beauty, with roses, carnations, gladioli, the fleur de mal, the flowers of art. And now, this is probably the last, oops, that wasn't what I wanted to do at all. Let's go back to what I was trying to do. Oops, pretend that didn't happen. Okay, allow it. What I'd like to do, if I can make this behave, is show you one last clip, and then I'll be very literary and talk about poetry until it's time to go. So I don't know if you're familiar with, this is the Chicano art collective Asco, which was making art. The individual artists, of course, still making art, but they were working as Asco in the 70s and 80s in LA. But they emerged as a kind of response both to the way Chicanos were being either typecast or left out of the art world at the time, and to the Chicano art movements that were already in place in LA, which they saw as really disconnected to the contemporary urban life they were living. They were sort of working against the mural movement. They were kind of not wanting to embrace the Aztec iconography. They had a different kind of set of ideas going on. So they're kind of like a doubly resistant little art movement. And here I'm going to play a couple minutes of them talking themselves a little bit about two of their most iconic productions, let's say. Let's see what they have to say. If it works. Oh, that's it. We're almost there. I'm sorry. Let's see if we can get to it. Bear with me. I'm not sure why it went away, but we'll see if we can do it. Any day now, it'll come back. And it's worth it. No, that's not going to work. We need the pictures, right? Let's try. Gentlemen. All right. Now we're stuck with Asco. We should have known this would have happened. All right, well, that doesn't seem to want to behave, so maybe what I'll do is go on with my presentation and come back to Asco later. But they're pretty awesome. So one of the things that they did, and I was kind of afraid this would happen, is They did all kinds of things in all kinds of media, but they started with what they had. So two things they did was they did a Stations of the Cross performance where they got themselves up in all kinds of makeup and sort of like dream versions of things you might actually see in the Stations of the Cross with all kinds of like makeup and kind of drag performance. And they marched through East LA and people kind of stared at them and joined the performance, and they ended up at the draft board where they left the cross and some popcorn there and shut the draft board down that day. And so no Chicanos signed up that day for the war in Vietnam. So that was the kind of way they went from these kind of like spectacular and actually very Jack Smith-like performances based on like no money and just what they had around, and actually moved it through space, and it accrued bodies and became political by design. Not by accident. I mean, these are sort of geniuses, I think. And then a year later, they did another performance when the authorities banned the Christmas parade because of rioting, quote unquote. The Christmas parade in East LA was banned. They made their own Christmas parade, and people joined the parade. And they say of it, in the first one, people joined because it seemed like a religious procession, and they were converted by religion. But in the second one, they knew it was art, and they were converted by art. So, Asco, find out more about them. We'll just pretend this didn't happen, and we'll move on. All right, so then I go back to talking about the gladiolus, but I feel like we get it. So now I'm just going to go through some examples of some places where I see the necropastoral functioning and some ways I read poetry using this. Okay, so I would like to talk to you about Dolores Dorantes' Estilo, and you can read a lot of this online in English and Spanish, but it's also going to be released as a book by Patrick Durgan's Kenning Editions here in Chicago, so look for it because it'll be out soon. So this is a 2011 poem by Dolores Dorantes, and this poem hosts, it's a book-length poem of units that look like this, and it hosts a phalanx of dead girls who have been killed in the narco violence along the US-Mexican border. Reanimated by the force of the poem, by art, these girls rise up and it's an ex-terminated army. And in Jen Hofer's translation, they form an implacable we. So the Spanish is on the top, I'll read the English on the bottom. This is the kind of thing that they say. This is not going to stop until you wake up, so give up. A gust of birds, a handful of girls like flowers. We're here for your preamble. We walk to you. Some of us arrive late to put on our muzzles. We have a mask of you, of your closed eyes. Someone calculated each face. Gold work applied painfully onto the skin of the sky. Someone's hand gave form to each lip. It created the lip and stimulated the lip. It created it like a blow. Someone placed on our mask your lip. So this army of dead girls shakes the sun from the sky and replaces it with ornament, orfebreria. Art's insignia, like as Yeats would say, as Grecian goldsmiths make of beaten gold and golden enameling, here stretches its own skin painfully up to replace the sky and replace the sun in the sky as counter-conquest. Art performs both massive and trivial transformations. The dead are reanimated, a massive change, while a series of lyric decorative images are daisy-chained together with a twist of art's hand, or syntaxes. Pájaros becomes nenos como flores. So, thanks to art's friable power, every surface is touched, changed, and made to host each other. Sky, skin, mask, lip, up, down, you, we, dead, living, all dismembered and commingled. The odd word order of Jen Hofer's translation of the final sentence conveys the denaturing effect. The uncertain doubling up of roles and agencies in the final sentence points to that forceful and/or of art's regime, this desire to have it both ways. Another quote from the poem reads, "We walk distant and empty before threatening. We are your lobelias with the legs you favor. Each time we attack, it is like giving you a kiss. Give us the presidency or the direction of the gunshots. We are the fresh fruits of war." So that's from Estilo by Dolores Dorantes. So with the sun knocked from the sky and replaced by unnatural ornament, art's interval thickens with anachronism, an ex-termination, time that won't quit, to paraphrase Suzanne Laurie Parks, because obviously any coming back of the dead is a kind of a reversal of the way time is supposed to run, right? It's already an anachronism, and as we know, revolutions also have this effect on time, this kind of suspension. Asco enforced like a one-day moratorium, at least on bringing Chicano bodies to the war. You know, art has different weird effects on time, and I like that anachronism, the non-linearity, and that's part of this necropastoral idea. So history is time that won't quit. This is a maxim from Suzanne Laurie Parks. Raul Zurita's Indelible Purgatorio from 1979. So this is the Chilean poet, and he was an engineering student. He was arrested and tortured, and when he came out of torture, he had already been writing poems, but when he survived his torture and came back to civilian life, the first thing that he did in real life, Raul Zurita, was to burn his cheek, sort of de-exterminating the torture, not leaving it out of sight, but bringing it into his body. He burned his own cheek. He has the scar to this day. And then he started writing a book, which he says he's never finished writing. The first book of it was Purgatorio, and this is how it begins. 1979, the opening act of a multi-decade revolutionary performance. It begins with the author ex-terminating, emerging from the black site of his own disappearance by burning his own cheek. Next comes the declaration, Me llamo Raquel. So he also changes gender when he exterminates. He comes back into visible space. He had disappeared into the black site of torture. He came back, and the first thing he did in this book is say, Me llamo Raquel, and then it continues, Me llamo Raquel. My friends think I'm a sick woman because I burned my cheek. It's the first stanza of this poem. The volume Purgatorio actually begins and re-begins many times. Like, if we had the volume here, you could see, you should check it out. Each apparent beginning, such as the verse I quote above, and or the statement Me llamo Raquel, and or a dedication, and or there's actually an identity card photo of Zurita with his burnt cheek in the book, and or the opening stanzas of the poem. All these are different openings, right? There are all these openings that open into the next opening that opens into the next opening. And every beginning can split to admit another beginning, which is another way of frying time, right? If you've read Aimé Césaire's Notebook of the Return to My Native Land, it keeps saying this phrase, at the end of daybreak, at the end of daybreak. And that phrase is always retranslated every time the poem's retranslated, trying to get a hold on what is this time that the speaker is saying, because it is a revolutionary time. And so it has to be said in this kind of non-linear way that you can't quite be translated, can't quite be pinned down. What is the end of daybreak? And so I think beginnings that won't begin, beginnings that keep pointing to other beginnings, are really important and interesting takes on time. This is a stuttering with advents and orifices. Advents and orifices, like a heap of girls or a split-apart body of one girl. This is the heaped-up, mutilated, commingled multibody that Zurita hymns when he hymns mass graves in his book, The Song for His Disappeared Love. In Purgatorio, the split-apart Raquel with her defaced face is comparable to the defaced women in Dolores Dorantes' Estilo, but she can announce herself as the site of naming, advening, scarification, sanctification, and splitting open. So Sunday morning, so that's the Roman numeral I, but in the book it's very unclear what's going on with it. So I left it there kind of unclear. It looks like a letter I. So I awake. A column has broken. I am a sainted woman, I say. So again, there's this naming and advening coming to the least likely speaker, the burnt woman who's supposed to be crazy, and she might be like a sex worker, it's hard to say. She's been abused, etc. But she is going to be Adamic, and she's going to start time over and over again in these tiny little triplets, I guess. So to attune by the degenerate velvet underground, the debased Raquel splits open time, declaring I awake. She declares an anachronistic now, which denatures the temporality of torture, imprisonment, or execution. It cannot be divorced from these because it is made of vulnerability itself. Zurita and Raquel coexist in an impossible and/or, from which conventionally preferred categories of maleness, bodily wholeness, rational self-preservation fall away. I mean, he burns his own cheek. It's crazy thing to do. This and/or is not self-sustaining, but defined by vulnerability to art, which it is continually and changeably reanimates this poem. Again, this is the political force of the Necropastoral. These are the anachronisms which defy paternalistic, materialistic, and imperialistic chronologies and hierarchies. You can join the dead girls when you are wrecked and ruined and reanimated by art, anachronism, ex-termination. To render a world full of holes where art can enter and from which it spills, a continuous commingling across which impossible bolts of and/or can leap, emerging to spectacular effects, rending hierarchies to shreds. An ex-termination, which rejects the implicit temporality of progress and forward motion conventionally associated with this term, and lifts instead banners of anachronism, wounds, paradox, art's forcefulness, art's insignias, pop music, makeup, the rose. With no health and no future but worms, which can move through art's ether and cross-contaminated art's atmospheres with impure effects and effects, we are in the realm of the undead, ex-terminated, but also radical possibility. So a source of a lot of my ideas about this actually comes from the great Korean master poet Kim Hyesoon, who we publish, and her translations by Domi Che. And this is from an essay called Space from Princess Abandoned, which you can find online in Domichi's translation. This is how the feminist poet Kim Hyesoon speaks of her own work. I, a woman poet on the road of darkness, the endless road of the text, follow the sound of my inspiration, outside of my insides, like the paradige who roams the Buddhist Elysium. I break and break apart in the darkness I have entered. This is how I can leave here and return to the place I had left. Each gap along my walk, each valley gets filled with me. I always sink into the hollow spaces between the fractured text. I gush out from the hollow and get dispersed with other things that have also gushed out from the hollow. The dispersed things break once again. So this is that kind of mass grave poetics that I've been pointing out so far. The dispersed things break once again. This doesn't mean that the text of my body, the text of my language is prophetic or mysterious. If it were mysterious, I could never do the work of fracturing the space of the real. So this is a very unusual set of claims, especially if you're just like me, have been educated in Western canon through a new critical lens. This idea that spectacle and immanence and like this kind of spiritual Elysium, like the movement of the shaman, somehow enters the space of the real, that it is real, and that it affects the real, and that this is political, but it comes from this place that is almost a broken apart body, the grave, exterminates into the space of the real to fracture it apart. This is a set of ideas we keep very separate in our ideas of genre and poetry when we think about poetry in the Anglo-American canonical space, but to me this is challenging and exciting for all the reasons I've been laying out today. Okay, but that's not what I want to have happen. Let's see what happens next. So then I performed this reading of this poem by Kim Hyesoon, translated Domiche, which I won't read you all because I think you get it at this point, but it's fun to read this poem, The Road to Kimpo Landfill. And this is just a very iconic poem of Kim Hyesoon's, and so I will read some of it to you so that you may enjoy it. Let's see. The Road to Kimpo Landfill. Cut my hair short again. I don't want to pull out the names etched onto my hair that grows daily. As rain fell, garbage bins from the second, third, and fourth floor must have turned upside down. Hair fell profusely. I kissed where I vomited all night long. Every time I sang, vomit flew in. So in the opening lines here, the speaker knows that her own body, her own black hair is etched with names. Her body is a membrane for dead matter to carry the names of the dead. But there can be no refusal of the dead's osmotic pressure because she says, cut my hair short, but there's all this hair in this poem anyway. And then the rain falls as garbage, hair falls, hair seems to fill the mouth of the poem, and various functions of the body become superimposed one on another, or which are rather than organized into separate systems. Rather than having the song of the poet fly like a bird from her throat, instead vomit flies in like a lawless gladiolus. Vomit, with its trace of digestion, decomposition, and inappropriate reemergence, replaces song and saturates the orifice of the speaker-singer, and also reverses conventional chronology, flying into her throat as if the film were running backwards. Oddly, this substitutes for a kind of impregnation with both babies and verse. The male is not needed, and chaos reigns. The poem continues. I turned the garbage bins upside down in my room and had morning sickness, then had a smoke. My poetry books burned. 300 million babies were born. 100 million of the young and old died. As in Marosa DiGiorgio's poem, in which the gladiolus is a vagrant flame in flaming papers and dresses, here burning is spectacular. The singer is pregnant with garbage, voluble with vomit. To burn is to birth. From her stratospheric tide of birth and death, a human swarm issues, like any other bodily fluid. This antithetical, ambivalent double power creates a necropastoral zone. Outside the apartment, the landfill, Kimpo landfill from the title, doesn't just fill the land, but every orifice and sensory organ with garbage, which is violence. Black plastic bags flew higher than a flock of sparrows. The discorded sewing machine was like a head of a horse. The sound of mother's sewing machine filled the holes in my bodies one by one. I tore off my swollen breasts and tossed them beneath mother's foot on the pedal. A forest gave off a foul smell, carried contagious diseases. It burned of fever during the night. A busboy at the brightly lit Motel Rose threw out millions of sperm every night. Here the boundaries of the bodies, inside and outside, are quite disoriented. The speaker's breasts are tossed off, smashed by the specter of the automaton mother. Her orifices are filled with an uncanny machinic drone, which by associative property impregnates the forest with fever. The busboy, like an ephebic gladiolus, throws out an impossible profuse bouquet of sperm blossoms from the brightly lit Motel Rose. In the logic of this poem, rather than a patriarch begetting a dynasty, one swarm begets another. Sound begets pregnancy, begets a diseased forest, begets millions of sperm, and the poem concludes necropastorically with a final sonic swarm. This is the end of the poem. From the forest, mosquitoes swarmed and dug into my scrawny, caved-in chest. Born in the 20th century, I was on my way to die in the 21st century. Here finally, and I am almost done, is the political force of the necropastoral. The necropastoral is not just a delinearized and literary model. Okay, say that again. The necropastoral is not just a delinearized literary model. It's not just a way of reading that allows us to activate occult resemblances in literary text separated by time, genre, media, or nation of origin, though it is that. So it's not just a literary model, although it is a literary model. The necropastoral is not just a thought experiment, a sublime literary landscape in which strange meetings, such as the one that I've shown you today, where we can talk about Asco, and we can talk about Nick Cave, and we can talk about Morrissey, and Marosa DiGiorgio, and Hyesoon, like we're jumping all over chronologically because we're tracing a pulse of art that unites these things. And rather than shallow, it's actually subterranean. I construe it as a cult. It's coming through, it's coming under, it's coming in any way it can, it's exterminating. Okay. So the necropastoral is also not just an ecopoetics based, which replaces conventional, I don't know why my grammar is breaking down. So, but what I'm trying to say here, it's not just a literary model. It's not just a thought experiment where we try to make crazy associations. It's not just an ecopoetics, which replaces balance, shape, order, or purity, or any of the usual values of ecopoetics with Anthropocene processes like decay, mutation, metastasization, half-lives, virality, extinction, but it is that. The necropastoral is all of these things. It's a literary model, a way of reading, a thought experiment, and an ecopoetics. But it is also, first and foremost, a politics. It is a radical disorientation away from the light and towards the darkness, towards the black sites, towards the black hole, towards the mass grave and the factory floor, the runoff pond and the radioactive cache. It is all of these, and it moves towards these. It is obscene because of its ex-terminations. It brings what is normally pushed out of the narrative of our contemporary paradigmatic ways of thinking spectacularly back into view. This ex-termination is power by paradox, often involves opposites. It's dressed in rags and in glamours, but it casts its own black, spectacular light. So to conclude, in an interview with Chilean Chicago translator and poet Daniel Berzotsky, Raul Zurita discusses his poetry in terms of hope. That it's a version of hope radically redefined from the ways we normally construe it in bourgeois society. And this is all a quote from Zurita, speaking of his book, Country of Planks. But as for these poems and how history informs them, it's a constructed country, a country of planks. And this also has a symbolic function. It also unites all of the victims. I think that poetry either touches zones of the humanity which we share, that goes beyond facts and details, that goes beyond statistics, and if it doesn't do this, then it's really not doing anything. In Europe, between 1912 and 1950, there were 80 million deaths. Who draws attention to this? That's what art is. Art draws attention to the things of this magnitude. Poetry is something like hope for that which has no hope. It's like the opportunity for that which has no opportunity. And what I'm trying to point out here is these are paradoxes. It's not saying like, you who have no hope, now you have hope. It's saying these two things coexist. Like the most hopeless place, like that's what we're going to validate and make the place of hope. The mass grave is the speaker of this poem. All of the mass grave bodies will somehow speak, and all of his poems are amazing for what that does to the lyric. Poetry is something like hope for that which has no hope. It's like the opportunity for that which has no opportunity. It's the most intimate and deepest perception of the collective acts taken against individuals that we are. In the end, the numbers conceal, statistics conceal, history conceals, and what is concealed emerges in the poems. This either emerges or it's nothing. Either the poem contains all the pain and shock of humanity confronting the biggest cataclysms, or if it doesn't, then poetry doesn't do anything. But beyond this, I just don't know. Why was it a country of planks? I don't know why. I know that I have the images of the barracks and that the Chacabuco prison camp was entirely made of planks. In this quote, Zurita positions poetry as a conduit for a magnitude of pain that goes beyond simple accounting. It goes beyond math. Amid this inundation with pain, poetry releases a something. And here, Zurita calls this something like hope. Poetry is something like the hope for that which has no hope. It's like the opportunity for that which has no opportunity. Poetry makes hope, but only when that hope is an irrational production, a strange material, another paradox, a negation of a negation. Poetry rips a hole in the world, but rather than opening up a new utopian vista, instead what it floods the world with is more of itself, its own whirling profusion, its excess, its magnanimity, its charisma, its black humor, its dark beauty, its rationality, its catastrophe that stops time, stutters it, catastrophizes, travesties time itself. Art will not be cleaned up, accounted for, or explained away, or compartmentalized, rationalized, or denied. Art sticks to everything, like a decaying corpse. Like Yeats said of Wilfred Owen, it's blood and dirt and a sucked sugar stick, unquote. Art holds the cranium of its neighbor in its rib cage. The something art makes will not become statistics. In its ex-termination, art is what reanimates, continually re-performs the horror as fable and as pageant. They call me a sick girl, writes Zurita, because I burn my face. We saw you wearing our mask, says Dorantes' dead girls. Now you'll never take it off. Hope is the negation of a negation. The thing with feathers sticking to the tarry mush where gas blew apart its intestines. It's a reference to albatrosses. Google that. The thing in the homecoming sash and the feathers. The thing on its way to the Kimpo landfill inside the black plastic bag. This is not going to stop until you wake up, so give up. Thank you. My presentation on this.